What secrets did the lavish walls of the imperial palace in 640 had truly hide? What unspeakable burdens did women carry behind their painted smiles in the name of imperial favor? Devastating price did they pay for a life many outside might have mistakenly called luxurious? Number 1. The ultimate erasure, post-death burdens and oblivion. Imagine a life lived in gilded captivity, a fragile existence constantly teetering on the edge of favor or fierce disgrace. Now extend that existence beyond the grave, beyond the final breath, into an afterlife dictated by the very powers that defined their earthly torment. For many women forced into concubinage in 640, a death was not an escape, but merely another chapter in their perpetual service, often marked by the ultimate erasure of their individual story. It was a harrowing reality that lurked in the back of their minds, a chilling whisper of their fate if they failed to secure enough favor, enough influence, or most crucially, a male heir. The Tang dynasty, a period of immense cultural flowering and imperial grandeur, was also a time when human lives, especially those of women, were meticulously categorized and controlled. Concubines, even those of high rank, were fundamentally considered possessions, extensions of the emperor's power and prestige. This meant their bodies, their time, and even their destinies after death were not their own. The most chilling manifestation of this control was the practice of entombment with the deceased emperor. While not every concubine faced this fate, it was a terrifying possibility, especially for those who had been close to the emperor but lacked the protective shield of a powerful family or a high-ranking son to secure their independence. Consider the immense tombs of the Tang emperors, vast subterranean cities built to mirror the imperial court above ground. These monumental structures were not just for the emperor and empress. They were often designed to house a retinue of those who had served him in life. For lower-ranking concubines, or those who simply fell out of favor by the time of the emperor's passing, their fate could be a grim procession into the dark earth. This was not always a voluntary act, nor was it always a given that they would be treated with the solemnity of a queen. Instead, it was often a final, stark demonstration of their status as property, their very essence absorbed into the imperial system even in oblivion. The historical records, sparse as they are, regarding the intimate details of individual concubines' lives, occasionally hint at such practices. The underlying logic was deeply rooted in ancient customs where loyal retainers, even beloved animals, were sometimes interred to serve their master in the spirit world. For a concubine, this meant her existence was not just a means to an end in life to provide pleasure, progeny, or companionship, but also a continuation of that service in the afterlife. The fear of this fate must have hung heavy in the perfumed air of the harem, a constant reminder that their value was entirely tied to their living service. To be chosen for this grim honor meant a premature end, a life cut short not by illness or old age, but by the decree of the imperial household, to accompany a man into the realm of ancestors. Beyond physical entombment, there was a more insidious form of erasure, the obliteration of their individual legacy. Empresses and powerful consorts, especially those who bore sons who became emperors, often had their own elaborate burial mounds, their names inscribed in history, their stories, however edited, passed down through official chronicles. But for the vast majority of concubines, especially those without children or whose children did not ascend to positions of power, their lives faded into a collective anonymity. Their names, if they were even recorded beyond the household register, were often forgotten. Their personal stories, their hopes, their sorrows, their small triumphs and profound despairs vanished like smoke. Imagine the crushing weight of knowing that your life, no matter how much you might have suffered, no matter what joys or pains you experienced, would ultimately be rendered meaningless, a mere footnote in the grand imperial narrative, if even that. There would be no proper shrines built in your memory, no poems composed in your honor by future generations, no family to mourn your passing and keep your spirit alive through remembrance. Their identities, which had been systematically stripped away during their lives, their original names replaced, their family ties severed, were finally dissolved entirely in the vast ocean of imperial history. They became simply a concubine of Emperor X, their individual human experience subsumed by their role, their service, and ultimately their disappearance. This profound oblivion was perhaps the most brutal suffering of all. It was the knowledge that even in death they would not find peace, but merely a continuation of their servitude, and that their very existence would be forgotten by the world. It was a future without memory, a void where a human life once thrived, however tenuously, their whispers, their laughter, their tears, all silenced, not just by death, but by the systemic forgetting that ensured the imperial narrative remained pristine, untouched by the individual tragedies that underpinned its splendor. They were the anonymous sacrifices upon which the magnificent Tang dynasty was built, their hidden sufferings buried not just in tombs, but in the deepest recesses of history itself. Number 2. The enduring trauma of forced sexual servitude. Beneath the veneer of silk and jade, beyond the carefully carbuted beauty of the imperial harem, lay a truth that whispered of profound suffering: the systematic commodification of a woman's body and the relentless pressure of forced sexual servitude. In 640, women designated as concubines were not chosen for their emotional connection or their personal desires. They were selected for their physical attributes, their lineage, or their potential to bear children, particularly sons, for the emperor. Their bodies ceased to be their own the moment they entered the imperial palace, becoming instead instruments of imperial succession and pleasure. Term sexual servitude might sound stark, but it accurately captures the reality of their existence. Concubines' primary duty was to be available to the emperor. At his whim, there was no concept of consent as we understand it today. A summons to the emperor's bedchamber was not an invitation, but an imperative. Refusal was unthinkable, carrying grave consequences ranging from severe punishment to outright banishment or worse. This constant expectation, this ever-present demand on their physicality, created a deep internal burden that few outsiders could ever comprehend. Imagine the psychological toll of never knowing when you might be called upon, of having your body scrutinized, evaluated, and used, irrespective of your personal feelings, your health, or your emotional state. Every night was a potential summons, every day a preparation for that possibility. This was not about love or mutual affection. It was about duty, power, and perpetuation of a dynasty. For many young women, often taken from their families at a tender age, this was their introduction to intimacy, an experience devoid of choice, imbued with a sense of obligation and an underlying current of fear. The process itself was often highly formalized. Concubines might be bathed, perfumed, and dressed in specific attire before being carried to the emperor's chambers. Their arrival was usually supervised by eunuchs, who meticulously recorded the time and the concubine's name, ensuring order and protocol. This bureaucratic nature further stripped away any semblance of romance or personal connection, reducing the encounter to a transactional act. The act of intimacy became a performance, a duty to be discharged, rather than an expression of human connection. To survive such an existence, many women would have developed emotional detachment. Their minds might separate from their bodies, creating a psychological barrier to cope with the lack of autonomy. They might learn to play a role, to offer a pleasant demeanor, to mimic contentment, while inside a different story unfolded, a story of quiet resilience, of suppressed pain, and of a profound loss of self. This detachment, while a coping mechanism, also isolated them further, preventing them from forming genuine connections with others or even with their own feelings. The physical strain was also immense. Pressure to conceive, particularly a male heir, meant that these encounters were not merely about pleasure but about reproduction. For some, the very act of intimacy became intrinsically linked to anxiety and hope, and then crushing disappointment if conception did not occur. For others, the constant cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, and the subsequent recovery, all while maintaining their duties and competing for favor, would have been exhausting. The emperor's affections were fleeting, often distributed among a vast number of women. To be favored one night did not guarantee future attention. This insecurity added another layer of psychological suffering. Concubine might strive to please, to be alluring, to make herself indispensable, not out of desire, but out of a desperate need for security and status within the perilous confines of the harem. The act of intimacy, therefore, was intertwined with survival, creating a perverse dynamic where their physical selves were tools in a larger game of power and influence. The enduring trauma would manifest in various ways. It could lead to a profound sense of dehumanization, a feeling of being used and discarded. It could foster deep-seated resentment, quiet bitterness, or even a complete loss of vitality. The lack of genuine connection, the forced intimacy, and the constant awareness of their bodies being public property would leave indelible scars on their psyche, shaping their relationships, their self-perception, and their entire worldview. Their lives were defined by their availability, their bodies, not their own. A fundamental suffering hidden beneath the elaborate displays of wealth and beauty. Number 3. The subtle and overt forms of abuse. The golden cages of the Tang dynasty imperial palace, while outwardly magnificent, often concealed a myriad of abuses that ranged from the subtly insidious to the overtly brutal. Beyond the widely understood physical violence, women forced into concubinage endured constant psychological torment, emotional manipulation, and systematic neglect that chipped away at their dignity, self-worth, and sanity. In 640, at the end, the hallowed grounds of the Forbidden City, suffering took many forms, some of which left no visible marks but festered deeply within the soul. One pervasive form of abuse was neglect. In a harem teeming with hundreds, sometimes thousands of women, many concubines, especially those who failed to capture the emperor's sustained attention or produce heirs, could simply be forgotten. Imagine being a beautiful, vibrant young woman, plucked from your family, promised a life of prestige, only to be consigned to a distant wing of the palace, never summoned, never noticed. This was not the same as being banished. It was far more insidious. It was the slow, agonizing death of hope, the crushing realization that you were utterly insignificant, merely one among countless faces in a sea of forgotten women. This neglect often meant isolation, lack of proper provisions, and a pervasive sense of uselessness that could lead to deep depression and despair. Their lives became a monotonous cycle of waiting, yearning, and eventually fading into obscurity. Emotional manipulation was another potent weapon wielded by the powerful, including the emperor himself, and often by the chief eunuchs or senior concubines. The emperor's favor was the ultimate currency in the harem. He could bestow gifts, titles, and privileges, or he could withdraw them arbitrarily, leaving a woman in a state of perpetual anxiety and insecurity. His affection could be a warm sun one day and a chilling wind the next, leaving concubines constantly striving to please, to anticipate his moods, and to suppress their true feelings. This created a climate of profound emotional instability, where self-worth was entirely dependent on the whims of another and authentic expression was a dangerous gamble. Public humiliation was a particularly cruel form of abuse, designed to assert dominance and control. A concubine who displeased the emperor or a powerful figure might be stripped of her rank, her servants, or her luxurious clothing. She might be forced to perform menial tasks, or even be publicly shamed, her beautiful garments replaced with coarse attire. Such acts were not just about punishment. They were about stripping away status and identity, reminding everyone of the precariousness of their position and the absolute power of the imperial will. For women whose lives revolved around prestige and appearance, Such public degradation was a devastating blow to their spirit. While not as common as other forms of abuse, physical violence was certainly not unheard of. Accounts, though often softened or hidden in official histories, suggest that punishment for disobedience or perceived transgressions could be severe. Beatings, confinement, or even more brutal forms of retribution were possibilities often carried out by eunuchs or palace guards at the behest of the emperor, or a powerful rival. The fear of such violence, even if rarely actualized for many, hung heavy in the air, ensuring compliance and reinforcing the complete lack of bodily autonomy. Moreover, the power dynamics within the harem meant that abuse could also come from fellow concubines. The intense rivalry for the emperor's favor often led to subtle forms of psychological warfare, spreading malicious rumors, planting incriminating evidence, or making false accusations. These acts, while not physically violent, could lead to severe consequences for the target, including demotion, banishment, or even death. Constant vigilance required to navigate these treacherous social waters was a form of daily psychological torture. Even the environment itself was abusive in its restrictions. Palace walls, while providing security, also served as an inescapable prison. Women were cut off from their families, their former lives, and the outside world. They lived under constant surveillance. Every move watched, every word overheard. This lack of privacy, this perpetual scrutiny, was a form of psychological oppression, leaving no space for personal thoughts, private grief, or genuine self-expression. Their lives were a performance, a constant act of conformity under the ever-present threat of punishment or neglect. The hidden screams of these women echoed through the ornate halls, unheard by the world outside. Number 4. The specter of disgrace and banished futures. In the opulent world of the Tang dynasty, imperial harem, a woman's life was a fragile, shimmering bubble, perpetually at risk of bursting. For every concubine who achieved lasting favor or gave birth to a future emperor, there were countless others who lived under the chilling specter of disgrace and the terrifying reality of a banished future. In 640, at the glittering palace walls, while offering unparalleled luxury, also served as a gilded prison from which there was no true escape. Once a woman's fortunes turned, the precariousness of their position was absolute. Concubine's status, her comfort, her very survival, depended entirely on the emperor's fickle favor. One wrong word, one perceived slight, one more alluring face catching his eye, and a woman's carefully constructed world could collapse in an instant. This insecurity fostered a perpetual state of anxiety. Every conversation was a calculation, every gesture a performance designed to secure her position. The lavish gifts and privileges could be revoked just as easily as they were bestowed, leaving a woman vulnerable and exposed. One of the most common and dreaded fates for a disgraced concubine was banishment to a Buddhist or Taoist temple. While this might sound like a peaceful retreat, it was anything but. For a woman accustomed to a life of luxury, servants, and endless leisure, being sent to a temple meant a stark reversal of fortune. They would be stripped of their fine silks, their jewels, and their personal attendants. Their heads would be shaved, their days filled with austere rituals and laborious duties. This was not a spiritual journey chosen out of devotion. It was a punishment, a slow and agonizing degradation of their former status. A famous example, though occurring slightly later in the Tang dynasty, illustrates this fate vividly. The future Empress Wu Zetian herself, upon the death of Emperor Taizong, was sent to Jia Temple, along with many other concubines who had not borne children. While she famously managed to return and ascend to unimaginable power, her initial banishment serves as a stark reminder of the common fate for those who lost their imperial protectors. Many other concubines, without her extraordinary cunning or powerful connections, would have languished in these temples until their deaths. Their youthful beauty faded, their imperial dreams shattered, living out their days in stark contrast to their gilded past. Beyond temples, other forms of banishment existed. Some might be sent back to their original families, which, while seemingly merciful, often carried immense shame for both the woman and her kin. To be returned implied failure, an inability to retain the emperor's favor, and could lead to social ostracization. For women whose families had relied on their imperial connection for prestige and influence, such a return could be devastating not just for the concubine, but for her entire clan. In more extreme cases, falling out of favor could lead to imprisonment, torture, or even execution. While official records rarely detail such brutal fates for concubines, historical anecdotes and the pervasive power dynamics of the imperial court suggest these possibilities were very real. Accusations of witchcraft, poisoning, or treason, often fabricated by rivals, could quickly escalate to a death sentence. The story of Emperor Xuanzong's favorite concubine, Yang Guofei, while much later than 640, it highlights the ultimate precariousness. During a rebellion, the emperor's own guards forced him to execute her for fear of her family's influence. While she was a beloved consort, her fate demonstrates how rapidly even the most favored could be sacrificed to political expediency. Even if a concubine managed to avoid these extreme outcomes, the fear of losing favor, of being demoted, of seeing her children's future imperiled by her own diminished standing, was a constant psychological burden. Their lives were a tightrope walk over an abyss of uncertainty. They were perpetually aware that their comfort, their position, and their very existence within the privileged walls of the palace were not guaranteed, but contingent upon a man's passing interest or the shifting tides of court intrigue. This knowledge, that their carefully constructed lives could shatter at any moment, was a profound and enduring suffering that tainted every luxurious moment. Number 5. The commodification of self, stripped of personal identity and autonomy. Imagine being plucked from your home, your family, your very name, and transported into a world where your existence is defined solely by your relationship to a powerful man. This was the stark reality for women forced into concubinage in 640. Their entrance into the imperial palace marked not just a change of residence, but a profound and devastating commodification of their very being. They were stripped of their personal identity, and their autonomy becoming instead objects of imperial pleasure, tools for political alliance, and vessels for dynastic succession. From the moment a woman was chosen to enter the harem, her personal identity began to unravel. Often her original family name would be superseded by a new title or a designation reflecting her rank within the imperial hierarchy. Her birth name, the name that connected her to her lineage, her childhood, and her individual self, would often be abandoned or rarely used. This renaming was a symbolic yet powerful act of severance, signifying that she no longer belonged to herself or her birth family, but now belonged to the emperor and the imperial institution. She was no longer just a daughter, a sister, or a friend. She was now concubine so-and-so, her identity reduced to her function. Her body, too, ceased to be her own. It became an instrument of the state, primarily intended to bear children for the emperor, especially male heirs. This meant a complete loss of bodily autonomy. Her reproductive cycles were monitored, her health managed not for her well-being, but for her fertility. Her presence in the emperor's bedchamber was not a matter of choice or desire, but of duty and command. She existed to be available, to be summoned at any time, her personal feelings and desires entirely irrelevant to the imperial will. This constant expectation, this perpetual readiness, was a profound violation of her selfhood, reducing her to a vessel beyond her body. Her entire life was meticulously controlled. She had little to no agency over her daily routine, her education, her diet, or even her friendships. Every aspect of her existence was managed by eunuchs and senior palace staff, all operating under strict imperial protocols. She could not leave the palace without permission, communicate freely with the outside world, or make any significant decisions about her own future. Her choices were minimal, dictated by the rigid rules of the harem and the whims of the emperor. This complete lack of personal freedom created a stifling atmosphere where individuality was suppressed and conformity was paramount. The loss of connection to their original families was another devastating blow to their identity. While sometimes they could send letters or receive limited visits, their relationship with their birth family was fundamentally altered. They were no longer integral members of their original household, but rather a distant imperial connection. For young women often taken from their homes at a very young age, this severance meant a profound loss of familiar comfort, familial love, and the sense of belonging that roots a person in the world. They were now in a foreign, often hostile, environment, stripped of their support system. Their talents and ambitions, unless they served the imperial agenda, were largely irrelevant. If a woman had aspirations beyond being a concubine, if she possessed artistic talents, intellectual curiosity, or leadership qualities, these were often either channeled into serving the emperor, e.g. composing poetry for him, playing music to entertain him, or simply stifled. Her personal desires, her unique personality, her dreams, all were sublimated to the singular purpose of existing for the emperor. The ongoing struggle to maintain a sense of self amidst this systematic erasure was a hidden suffering that few could perceive. It was the internal battle to remember who they were before they became a concubine, to hold on to fragments of their original identity in a world that sought to homogenize them. Some might have found solace in art, in quiet contemplation, or in fleeting moments of genuine connection with a trusted maid. But for many, the commodification of their selfhood led to a profound sense of loss, a gnawing emptiness where their vibrant individuality once resided. Their existence became a reflection of their master's will, a tragic testament to lives lived not for themselves but for the glory of an empire. Number 6. The fierce battleground of the harem, rivalry and sabotage. Beneath the serene surface of the imperial palace, where cherry blossoms bloomed and silk rustled softly, the Tang dynasty harem in 640 AD was a relentless battleground, a world where women were pitted against each other in a desperate, often deadly, competition. This intense rivalry and the pervasive threat of sabotage constituted a profound hidden suffering, forcing concubines to live in a perpetual state of paranoia, suspicion, and fear. The emperor's favor was the ultimate prize, the sun around which all their lives revolved. It guaranteed luxury, comfort, security, and perhaps most importantly, the chance to bear an imperial heir, especially a son, which was the ultimate key to lasting power and protection. With so many women vying for the attention of one man, the environment became hyper-competitive. Every smile, every gift, every word from the emperor's lips was scrutinized, fueling envy and ambition among the women. This competition manifested in myriad ways, from subtle psychological warfare to outright dangerous machinations. On one end of the spectrum were petty slights and social maneuvering. A rival concubine might spread rumors about another's background, her lack of refinement, or even her perceived ill health. She might subtly undermine her opponent's beauty rituals, ensure she received less fashionable clothing, or arrange for her to be overlooked during imperial functions. These might seem trivial from an outsider's perspective, but in the cloistered world of the harem, where appearance and imperial recognition were everything, such actions could significantly damage a woman's standing, and prospects. More sinister tactics involved direct sabotage. This could range from manipulating eunuchs and maids to provide false reports about a rival's conduct, to stealing or damaging precious items, to even more dangerous schemes. Accusations of witchcraft, though heavily punishable, were not unheard of. Concubine might be framed for a transgression she did not commit, leading to her demotion, banishment, or even death. The slightest misstep, real or fabricated, could be exploited by a jealous rival to secure her downfall. Poisoning, while likely rare and highly secret due to the severe penalties for such acts, was a dark specter that haunted the minds of many. Stories often whispered rather than openly discussed of rivals attempting to poison a concubine's food, her cosmetics, or even her unborn child would have circulated, fueling intense paranoia. Every meal, every drink, every gesture of supposed kindness from a rival might have been viewed with suspicion, forcing concubines into a constant state of vigilance. Trust was a luxury they could ill afford. The fierce competition for a male heir was arguably the most brutal aspect of this rivalry. The birth of a son elevated a concubine's status immeasurably, securing her future and that of her family. This meant that women would go to extreme lengths to ensure their own fertility and undermine that of their rivals. This could involve trying to ensure their opponent was never summoned to the emperor's chambers, or even, in the darkest corners of rumor and fear, attempting to induce miscarriages or harm newborns. The famous, albeit later, story of Empress Wuzesian allegedly murdering her own infant daughter to frame a rival empress illustrates the ruthless depths to which imperial competition could sink, even if such extreme acts were exceptional. Living in such an environment meant that true friendship was a rarity. Any apparent camaraderie between concubines was often superficial, a strategic alliance that could shatter at any moment. Every woman was a potential rival, every smile a potential mask for envy. This isolation, born of constant suspicion, was a profound emotional burden. The psychological toll of living in a perpetual state of conflict, constantly watching one's back, never knowing who to trust, and always fearing betrayal was immense. It fostered anxiety, depression, and a deep sense of insecurity, turning the luxurious palace into a gilded cage of constant psychological warfare. Number 7. The relentless pressure for a male heir and the fear of barrenness. In the meticulously structured world of the Tang dynasty imperial harem in 640, and a woman's ultimate value, her security, and her path to lasting influence hinged overwhelmingly on one single critical achievement: the birth of a male heir. This relentless pressure to produce a son for the emperor, coupled with the terrifying specter of barrenness, constituted a profound and pervasive, hidden suffering for concubines, shaping every aspect of their lives within the palace walls. From the moment a woman entered the harem, the unspoken expectation, often the very reason for her selection, was her potential to contribute to the dynastic line. While daughters were cherished, a son, especially a legitimate son of the emperor, was the cornerstone of the imperial succession. For a concubine, bearing a son was not merely a biological event. It was a strategic imperative. It elevated her status, secured her future, and provided her with a powerful advocate within the court, her own child, who, if he ascended to the throne, would ensure her prestige and comfort for life. Conversely, the inability to conceive or the continuous birth of only daughters was a source of immense anxiety and potential catastrophe. Barrenness, or even just failing to produce a son quickly, could lead to a woman's swift demotion, neglect, or even banishment. Imagine the monthly dread, the constant worry, the desperate hopes attached to every cycle. The weight of an entire dynasty's future, or at least a powerful faction of it, rested indirectly on her womb. This pressure could be debilitating, transforming the intimate act of procreation into a stressful, high-stakes performance. Concubines would often resort to various measures, sometimes desperate, to ensure fertility. They might consume traditional Chinese medicine concoctions believed to enhance conception, perform rituals, or consult with court physicians and eunuchs who specialized in such matters. Every possible avenue would be explored to fulfill this paramount duty, highlighting the extreme lengths they were driven to in their pursuit of an heir. The intense competition within the harem further exacerbated this suffering. Each concubine knew that another's success in bearing a son meant a potential threat to her own standing. The emperor's attention, limited as it was, would inevitably gravitate towards the mother of a strong, healthy male heir. This fueled not just jealousy but genuine fear. Childless concubine, or one with only daughters, faced the real possibility of being eclipsed, forgotten, or cast aside for younger, more fertile women. Moreover, in some historical periods and variations of harem practice, it was not uncommon for a high-ranking concubine or even the empress, if she was barren, to adopt the son of a lower-ranking concubine. While this might have secured the child's future, it was a profoundly painful experience for the birth mother. She would carry and give birth to her child only to have him taken away and raised by another, often seeing him only from a distance or under strict supervision. The emotional agony of such a separation, the denial of her maternal bond while her child was used to bolster another woman's position, was a hidden suffering of immense proportions. The fear of not having a son permeated every aspect of a concubine's life. It influenced her relationships with other women, her interactions with the emperor, and her own self-perception. Her personal worth became inextricably linked to her reproductive capacity. If she failed in this fundamental duty, her life could become one of quiet despair, knowing that her best chance at security and meaning within the palace had eluded her. This constant gnawing fear of inadequacy and future insecurity, all tied to the biological lottery of childbirth, was a relentless psychological burden that weighed heavily on the hearts and minds of women forced into concubinage in 640 AD. Number 8. The psychological toll of constant surveillance and scrutiny. Step inside the majestic, sprawling imperial palace of the Tang dynasty in 640, and you're met with a breathtaking display of power and beauty. For the women confined within its walls, especially the concubines, this grandeur came at an unbearable cost. The relentless, suffocating weight of constant surveillance and scrutiny. Every move, every word, every gesture was watched, analyzed, and judged, creating a psychological burden that chipped away at their privacy, their authenticity, and ultimately their sanity. The imperial harem was a highly regulated environment, overseen by an elaborate network of eunuchs and female attendants. Eunuchs, castrated men who served the emperor and his household, held immense power within the inner court. They were the eyes and ears of the emperor, responsible for maintaining order, enforcing rules, and reporting on the conduct of everyone within the harem, especially the concubines. Their omnipresence meant that concubines were rarely truly alone. From the moment they woke until they retired, their lives were observed, their conversations potentially overheard, their actions documented. This pervasive surveillance fostered an atmosphere of deep paranoia. Whom could they trust? Their personal maids, while ostensibly loyal, could also be informants. Other concubines, driven by intense rivalry, were always looking for a weakness, a misstep to exploit. Even seemingly innocent actions could be misinterpreted or deliberately twisted into something nefarious. A whispered comment about another concubine, a subtle sign of displeasure, or a fleeting moment of sadness could be reported, leading to dire consequences. The constant scrutiny meant that concubines had to maintain a carefully curated persona at all times. They could not afford to show their true feelings, their vulnerabilities, or their genuine desires. Every interaction became a performance. They had to perfect the art of the demure smile, the respectful bow, the elegant gesture, even when their hearts were aching or their minds were racing with fear and anxiety. To show weakness was to invite exploitation. To show too much ambition was to invite suspicion. This relentless pressure to perform, to present a perfect facade, proved emotionally exhausting. Privacy, a fundamental human need, was virtually non-existent. Their personal chambers, while luxurious, were not sanctuaries from prying eyes. Eunuchs might enter without much warning, maids were always present, and even the emperor himself could visit at any moment unannounced. There was no space for quiet reflection, no moment for genuine relaxation, no opportunity to simply be themselves without the awareness of being watched. This constant lack of personal space and the inability to escape the gaze of others created a profound sense of claustrophobia and mental imprisonment. The psychological toll of living under such conditions was immense. Many concubines would have developed chronic anxiety, never truly feeling safe or secure. They might have become overly cautious, withdrawing into themselves to avoid any potential missteps. Depression was likely common, stemming from the profound loneliness and the suppression of their true selves. For some, the constant pressure and paranoia could even lead to psychological breakdown as their minds struggled to cope with the relentless scrutiny and the impossibility of genuine self-expression. This wasn't just about avoiding punishment. It was about the erosion of the self. When your every action is judged, when authenticity is dangerous, and when your inner world must be meticulously guarded, a piece of who you are inevitably withers. The concubines lived in a world where appearances were everything, and the truth of their inner lives remained hidden, a profound and silent suffering known only to them. The magnificent palace, with its sprawling gardens and ornate halls, became a gilded cage, trapping not just their bodies but their very souls under the unblinking eye of the imperial machine. Number 9. The invisible chains of isolation and loneliness. The imperial palace of the Tang dynasty in 640 had shimmered with opulence, a world of grandeur and beauty designed to reflect the emperor's boundless power. Yet within these magnificent walls, amidst hundreds of fellow concubines, eunuchs, and maids, many women endured a profound and debilitating suffering. The invisible chains of isolation and loneliness. Despite being constantly surrounded by people, they lived lives of deep emotional solitude, a gilded existence that felt more like a prison than a privilege. Imagine a world where true connection is a dangerous luxury. Concubines were plucked from their families, often at a young age, and severed from their roots. Their former friends, their childhood homes, the comforting routines of their past, all were left behind. They entered a new, unfamiliar environment, one defined by strict hierarchy and relentless competition. This initial separation alone was a source of immense grief and a foundational layer of loneliness. Within the harem itself, forming genuine trusting relationships was incredibly difficult, almost impossible. Every woman was a potential rival, competing for the emperor's limited favor, for resources, and for the crucial chance to bear an heir. A seemingly friendly gesture could mask ulterior motives. A shared secret could become a weapon in the hands of a jealous competitor. This atmosphere of pervasive suspicion meant that concubines were often wary of each other, unable to open up or forge deep bonds. Superficial pleasantries and polite conversations masked a deeper emotional guardedness. The constant awareness that one's downfall could be another's rise stifled any true camaraderie. Even with their personal attendants, such as maids and eunuchs, the relationship was complex, while some might develop genuine loyalty and affection. These servants were ultimately bound by their duties to the imperial household and the emperor. They were often informants reporting on the concubine's conduct, and their own survival depended on upholding the rules and pleasing those in power. This meant that concubines could never fully trust their closest companions, creating a constant sense of emotional vigilance, never truly letting down their guard. The emperor himself, the central figure in their lives, was often a source of profound loneliness rather than connection. He had hundreds of women at his disposal, and his affections were fleeting and widely distributed. For a concubine, intimacy with the emperor was rarely about genuine affection or mutual understanding. It was a duty, a performance, and a strategic interaction. They were often seen as interchangeable, their individual personalities overlooked in favor of their role. This lack of true emotional connection with the man who held their entire fate in his hands fostered a deep sense of being unseen, unheard, and fundamentally alone in their relationship with him. For those concubines who fell out of favor, the isolation could become absolute. Neglected in distant wings of the palace, forgotten by the emperor, and avoided by other ambitious women, they could spend years in agonizing solitude. Their days might be monotonous, filled with quiet despair. Their only companions the silent walls of their chambers and the fading memories of a life they once knew. This was not a physical loneliness of being alone in a room, but a profound emotional solitude, a sense of being utterly disconnected from the human world. The gilded cage, for all its material comforts, was designed to keep women apart from the outside world, from their past, and from genuine human connection. The inability to freely express themselves, to share their fears, their hopes, or their grief, meant that a vast reservoir of emotion remained trapped within them. This internal isolation, combined with a lack of trustworthy external relationships, created a devastating psychological burden. Quiet desperation of these women, yearning for genuine human connection, for a sympathetic ear, for someone who saw them as a person and not just a concubine, was an enduring and profound suffering that silently echoed through the grand halls of the Tang imperial palace.